Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, everybody. This is session 6.2 of the Transport and Mobility panel. We've got a great lineup today talking about the electrification of transport. I'm hosting this from my cyber shed in Oxford, or near Oxford in the UK. A lovely Mediterranean day here, and we've got a great cast of speakers from all over the place: India, Germany, Portugal, UK, and otherwise. So we're looking, a great example of communication without travel, perhaps. Starting up this morning, the session, we have Cornelius Moll. Cornelius, just a little introduction to Cornelius. He studied industrial engineering at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, KIT, and at Singapore Management University. He's been working in the Competence Center Energy Technology and Energy Systems in the business unit economy since May 2015 as a researcher and project manager. From 2015 to 2019, as well as working at ISI, he's also completed a doctorate at the University of Hohenheim on the topic Sustainable Service Innovations in Logistics, an Approach to Developing Decision Models. Cornelius, I think we're going to see your video and then we'll chat with you about it afterwards. Thanks very much.
Welcome to my presentation, Attractiveness of Electric Vehicles under Current Tax and Incentive Schemes in Germany. My name is Cornelius Moll, and I'm working for Fraunhofer ISI in Karlsruhe, Germany. What can you expect from my presentation? It's split in 4 parts. I'll start with the motivation and objectives of our research. I'll outline the methods and data we used, present some results, and come to an end with a discussion and some conclusions. So if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union, the transport sector is relevant for almost 1/4 of the total emissions. If you have a closer look at the transportation sector, you'll find out that it's mostly cars that are relevant, that are responsible for these emissions, almost 44% of the emissions in the transportation sector. So if you want to do something about climate change, you should address cars. And the option there are electric cars. Market shares in Germany are increasing over the last years, up to 22% market share on all registrations in Germany, which is quite remarkable. However, it still means that almost 80% of the cars that are newly registered are conventional cars with a combustion engine. Why is that? Well, because customers care about money. And this was the objective of our research. We wanted to determine the attractiveness of electric vehicles in comparison with conventional combustion engine driven vehicles, the total cost of ownership calculation from the user's point of view with a focus on Germany. How do we differ from existing literature? Well, first, we included all taxes and incentives that are in place currently. And second, we wanted to base our calculations, where possible, on real world data. So for fuel consumption, electric driving shares, and so on, have most realistic data possible. And that led us to 2 research questions. So first of all, how do the different powertrains and segments compare in a user-centric TCO calculation? And second, what impacts do taxes and incentive schemes have on the TCO? We analyzed different powertrains, so gasoline, diesel, methane, battery electric, and plug-in hybrid electric. The segments small, compact, and SUV, and 2 years of purchase, 2020, and a glimpse into the future, 2030. We used a total cost of ownership calculation, which includes all costs connected to the purchase and use of a car. until the resale of a car. So you have to include a price, purchase price, retail price for the car, subtract potential subsidies, which we did here, but also subtract a residual value when you sell your car after using it for a couple of years. Then there are the variable costs, which rely on the vehicle kilometers driven. These are energy costs on the one hand, and repair and maintenance costs on the other hand. In addition to that, there are annual fixed costs like insurance costs, taxes, infrastructure costs, at least for electric cars when you have a home charging opportunity. I will not go into the details of all these parameters and assumption, but focus on the ones that are highlighted here in bold. Service life or ownership period is assumed to be 7 years, which is the average for new cars bought in Germany. How did we determine the purchase prices and the technical specifications of the cars for our analysis? For 2020, we used registration weighted average of the top 5 models per segment and per powertrain. The data was derived from the General German Automotive Association, ADAC. For 2030, it was a bit more complicated. We used a bottom-up cost model based on the vehicle components. So we took the 2020 purchase price, subtracted the 2020 powertrain specific component costs, so costs for engine transmission, for lithium-ion battery when it's an electric car, power electronics, and also electric motors. And that led to a vehicle body price, which was again the basis for our further calculations. So taking the vehicle body price and adding 2030 powertrain specific vehicle components that we derived by a very deep and profound meta-analysis led us to 2030 purchase prices. We also included a range increase for the electric cars, so 400, 500, 600 kilometers for the battery electric small compact SUV car, and 80 to 100 kilometers for the PHEVs. This resulted in the vehicle purchase prices for the different years, powertrains, and segments that you find in the table right here. Purchase price premiums in Germany are quite high at the moment. So when you buy an electric car, you get 9,000 euros when the car costs less than 40,000 euros. SUVs, in our assumptions, in our calculations, are a bit more expensive, which reduces the price premiums to 7,500. Another reduction is there for PHEVs, which have about 6,500 and 5,600 euros. Vehicle tax is calculated based on fuel consumption, engine displacement, and powertrain. Battery electric cars are exempted from the tax. There's also a reduction for PHEVs, but only until 2024. And for the other conventional cars, you see the taxes here. Which was also very important for us is the real world correction factor to account for differences between the values of fuel consumption you read in the car catalog and the one you have in real life. There is a quite big difference between the test cycles and the values in real life. And for that reason, we derived a correction factor. We used data from Split-Monitor. This is an online website and also an app that allows users to track and monitor fuel consumption of their private cars. And for the electric cars, we used laboratory tests from the real-world tests from the ADAC for the fuel consumption. So this allowed us to reflect best possible way the consumer's perspective. The results. Here you see the individual cost components of the total cost of ownership, so invest, energy costs, repair and maintenance, and so on. But the most important and interesting one are the total cost of ownership. Here it's the TCO for a compact car for year 2020, year 2030. And what you see is that for 2020, electric cars are the most economical option. Well, battery electric cars. They are followed by methane-powered vehicles and plug-in hybrids. Why is that? Well, the orange bar indicates high purchase price premiums for electric cars and low operating costs for the battery electric cars, but also for methane-powered vehicles. When you look at the year 2030, you see that all of the TCO converge. So they are pretty identical, but still the battery electric car is the most economical option, despite there are no more purchase price premiums. So these are not present in 2030 anymore, but still electric cars are a quite competitive option. This is not the case for SUVs that you see here. The methane-powered vehicles in both years are the cheapest option, followed by diesel, followed by gasoline cars. But the problem here is that the investments, the purchase price of the vehicles are very high. And that high price of electric vehicles cannot be offset by the low operating costs. And then we also have an increasing range assumption, and that further increases battery costs. So in 2020 and 2030, battery electric or plug-in hybrid electric SUVs are not really an interesting option. Problem is, SUVs have a high mass, thus high energy consumption, and if you want a certain range, that requires big batteries, which are costly, and they are heavy. So for that reason, for SUVs, electric options are not really interesting. Then we compared the TCO in a scenario with and without taxes. You see the different segments, you see the different powertrains, and the gray bars are the scenario with taxes and incentives. The blue one is without taxes and incentives. Which taxes and incentives did we include? Well, value-added tax or sales tax, purchase price premiums, CO2 charges, energy taxes, but also vehicle taxes and surcharges on electricity. And we find that the conventional cars show substantially lower TCO in the non-tax scenario in all segments. That decrease is much lower for electric vehicles. And for the battery electric cars in small and compact segment, there is even an increase of the TCO. Well, because there are no more purchase price premiums, making them a much costlier option. Also, in total, in the scenario without taxes, gasoline and diesel vehicles are the most economic option, or conventional, including methane. This is because there is no CO2 tax in the scenario without taxes. So let's discuss some of the aspects here. First of all, the service life. The ownership period is assumed to be 7 years, but the car will not be scrapped after that. So if the high investment of electric cars can be offset over a longer utilization period, which is usually the case, then probably the advantage of EVs would be higher. Second, the range assumptions for 2030 are quite high, also not very favorable for electric vehicles. Then methane-powered cars were a quite cheap, quite economical option, but they were not really successful on the market over the last years. So it shows that despite their lower costs, they don't diffuse on the market. Obviously, they're not that attractive. And the question is, if combustion engine cars will still be sold in 2030, looking at conventional combustion engine bans in several countries in Europe and all over the world. So all in all, EVs are currently the most economical option in the compact car segment. In the SUV segment, methane-powered and gasoline cars are more economical than EVs. In the compact car segment, in future, EVs remain competitive, and that even without direct subsidies. In a scenario without considering taxes and incentives, well, EVs are not really competitive, which shows that we need a redistribution of the costs if the aim is to increase EVs' attractiveness. So price premiums turn out to be a good measure, increasing the attractiveness. Also, the CO2 tax is a factor which increases the competitiveness. But there is one more and last issue. The consumers tend to focus on the purchase price when buying a car rather than on the TCO, which are currently already favorable for EVs. And that requires making that more obvious to the user. So probably TCO labels for cars, similar to the energy labeling of cars in Germany, might be a solution. Thank you very much, and I'm open for questions.
Hi, Cornelius. Thank you very much for that very interesting and wide-ranging presentation about the prospects for vehicle electrification. I think it prompts lots of potential questions. So please do submit them into Hoover or Zoom if you're on Zoom. Just a couple from me. I mean, there are some obvious questions about your assumptions about the decline in battery costs, and you know, I've seen several projections of price parity coming much sooner than your study seems to be projecting. So I just wonder whether you would consider the battery cost declines to be perhaps conservative, or where on the range of forecast do they come?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue that is always discussed when it comes to battery electric vehicles. For 2020, our assumption, or not our assumption, but what we saw from the market is that costs are around 150 euros per kilowatt hour, but not on a cell level, but on a battery system level. So battery system includes the cell packed in modules, including power electronics, heat sensors, and all of that. So total battery pack costs at 150 euros in 2020. Of course, when you hear Tesla, it's $60 per kilowatt hour, but these are different cells, and these are cells, not entire battery packs. So 150 as assumption for 2020. For 2030, our assumption is that, of course, there is a decline in battery costs, and we assume for 2030, 80 euros per kilowatt hour as battery system costs. In total, I would say it's quite in the middle of the projections. Of course, you have projections that go a lot deeper than that, 40, 50 euros per kilowatt hour, but also there are other projections that say, well, due to other material that is used and so on, those might be a bit higher. So there is a decline. We almost consider, half of, or a decrease by 50% until 2030.
Okay, thank you. And what about assumptions about battery durability, and is there any requirement for replacement? I mean, I think the indications we're seeing is that there will not be a need for battery replacement in the normal lifetime of vehicles, but I wonder what assumptions you made.
Yeah, this is also our assumption, and not only assumption, but we discussed that with colleagues from another department who are really deep in battery research. And for private vehicles, battery replacements are not needed at all. So you will be able to have 200,000 up to 300,000 kilometers of total mileage on that battery until it reaches 80% of its original capacity, which means you can still use it like your smartphone, but of course it's not very comfortable being able only to have a reduced battery capacity and thus range. But yeah, no replacements, according to our knowledge, will be needed for private vehicles. A bit different probably in commercial applications where you have a lot higher mileages. For small trucks, for medium trucks, the mileage is up to 10 times the mileage of private vehicles. So yeah, this is definitely an issue there.
Another interesting aspect that you raised is, as I understood it, you're projecting that consumers will be looking for even higher range than is currently offered. But I wonder, in response to that, whether how the manufacturers will respond. I mean, a couple of sort of bits of evidence, perhaps in the UK. The government's recently cut the grant level in UK. You're probably aware. So about £3,500 for electric vehicles with a 35,000 cap. In response to that, we saw pretty much all the manufacturers with vehicles anywhere near 35k reducing their the price of those vehicles to get them below the cap and therefore grant eligible. I think also I've got an EV, but I'm looking around for a different one, and I'm noticing that in many cases you have an option of different battery packs, sort of ranging from sort of 40 something kilowatts to upwards of 60, 70 sometimes, implying different ranges but different costs. So perhaps we're understating the potential for the manufacturers to be more innovative in the way they sell these things to us.
Definitely, yeah. I think over the next few years, manufacturers will see which battery packs do customers choose. Is it always medium battery pack, biggest battery pack, and so on? And this also shows then the customer preferences. And if it's always the medium or the lowest battery pack, well, then obviously the range is not the decisive factor, because let's be honest, 300, 400 real range, I'm not talking about the WLTP, so the test cycle ranges, because these tend to be overestimating real range, but 300, 400, or 500 is definitely a range that customers should be able to cope with. Additionally, fast charging network is improved over time, so this will also increase the range, not directly, but indirectly, of electric cars. So our range assumptions for 2030 are a bit, very high assumptions.
Yeah, I think you could also argue that actually all the pressure should be to reduce the embedded battery range, and given that most journeys are average of 10 miles or something, and the exception is a journey of more than, say, 100 miles. As recharging infrastructure improves, actually consumers may say, all I need is 100 miles because I can top up a fast charge on the way, which could significantly change the way things look.
Definitely. Well, this is also a topic for our social scientists who are doing research on the actual buying criteria and range anxiety. This is still an issue. We see that it's decreasing because people more and more realize, well, as you said, for 80 or even 90% or 95% of the daily driving, a range of 100 kilometers or miles, whatever, would be totally enough. and it's only 2 or 3 times a year or 5 times when I really want to visit some friends further away. So yeah, I think this might also change, that people get a more realistic feeling how they actually drive, especially when gas prices are increasing as they are doing in Germany, especially. Really hot debate on that issue. And then people think more about their mobility behavior. At least I hope that, but I also trust in that.
Thanks, Cornelius. I'm sure we'll come back to your paper in the discussion afterwards, but for now, thank you very much. We should move on because of time pressure. So the next presentation is from Hamza Abid. Hamza is talking about transport electrification scenarios for the decarbonisation of the European transport sector by 2050. Just a few words about Hamza. He's an early career energy researcher engaged as a research assistant at the Sustainable Energy Planning Group at AAU in Copenhagen. He holds a double master's in energy engineering from KU Leuven, Belgium, and KTH, Sweden. His present research focuses energy efficiency in the transport sector and on sector coupling. Together with his colleagues, he works with the scenario analysis of smart energy systems within the broad framework of energy systems analysis. So Hamza, look forward to speaking to you shortly.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this pre-recorded version of the presentation. My name is Hamza Abid, and on behalf of my colleagues at Aalborg University, I'll be presenting the topic of transport electrification scenarios for decarbonization of the European transport sector by 2050. To talk a bit about the background of this particular study is that this study is part of the larger project, which is the Synergies project. And in the Synergies project, we believe in the energy efficiency first principle, and that energy efficiency should be at the core of the European policy making if Europe is to achieve its decarbonization goals by 2050. And we try to estimate the energy efficiency potentials for the different sectors in this project, and one of those sectors is the transport sector. And if in particular we look at the European transport sector and development up till now, we find that the transport sector has been lagging behind quite a lot as compared to the other sectors. So, for example, if you see on the slides here, the final energy consumption in 1990 for the transport sector was around 25%, whereas it has increased to about 31% in 2017. Now, for example, for the industry sector, you see a reduction in the final energy demand. You see a huge increase for the transport sector, and this is despite the prevalence of all the policy instruments that has been targeted towards the transport sector. And if we look at some of the sources for CO2 emissions in this sector, and we break it down into different categories, we find that the majority of the emissions, they come from road transport. So around 74% come from the road transport. And if we further break it down, is around 63% in 2015, of course, 63% of the emissions come from the passenger cars, 25% from light duty vehicles, and another 12% from the heavy duty trucks. So the passenger cars are really at the core of the polluting problem here. And if we talk about why electrification is well suited for transportation, is because we believe the time is right for electrification, and there has been seen a lot of advancements in, for example, battery technology and power electronics that has led to a sudden increase in the demand of electric vehicles in the market. And electrification seems to be one of the most energy efficient forms of propulsion that is for the transport sector. So, for example, you can see here that the battery electric vehicles have a well-to-wheel efficiency of around 73% as compared to their internal combustion engine counterparts, which have an efficiency of just around 13%. So you can see the huge disproportionate differences in energy efficiency, and which ultimately have a huge impact on the overall transport sector. If we talk a bit about the other sectors, which are the aviation and the shipping sectors, now these are the sectors which are somewhat considered a bit difficult to electrify, because, for example, in the aviation sector, they have certain constraints which are for policy about the maximum takeoff weight. So the huge batteries that are needed for propulsion are not at the right energy density point for electrification, direct electrification of aviation. And similarly, the dead weight tonnage requirements for the shipping industry also do not allow huge batteries to be on board the shipping vessels. This is where indirect electrification methods like the use of electrofuels could be quite useful for electrification. Now, it is somewhat understood that electrification for road transport should be done by battery electric vehicles, and indirect electrification should be mostly suited for shipping and the aviation sector. But the heavy-duty trucks is somewhat in the middle. So that is one of the core questions that we try to answer with the study, that what are the cost and energy demands associated with the electrification of the European transport sector by 2050? And we compared it with the PRIME's baseline, which we regard as the business as usual scenario. And another question that we try to answer in the study is that if direct electrification or indirect electrification is better suited for heavy-duty trucks. Now, the way that this study is set up is by using a transport modeling tool called the transport plan tool. And this tool was developed by Aalborg University in 2012 for the transport modeling of Denmark. And the tool, basically what it is a very data-intensive bottom-up analysis tool. So it takes into account a lot of inputs in different forms of data. So, for example, the transport system cost, transport technology efficiencies, the annual growth and modal shift rates from the present to the future, the transport technology shares from the present to the future, and the transport activity demand, which are in this case taken from the National Travel Service for 28 different countries. And if we talk about the scenarios, the main point of departure from the baseline for these scenarios is the transport technology shares, where if we go, for example, towards if we go, for example, towards the electrification and e-fuel scenario and the electrification plus scenario, and the point of departure from the PRIME's baseline is mainly the percentage differences in the implementation of different technologies in 2050. So, for example, you can see here the PRIME's baseline. There's still a lot of fossil fuel in the business as usual scenario for 2050, whereas these two different electrification scenarios are considered to be decarbonization scenarios. And the main point of departure between the electrification plus and the electrification and the e-fuel scenarios is the use of electric road networks for heavy-duty trucks. So here it's assumed that the 73% of the ERS, the 73% of the demand for heavy-duty trucks and freight transport in electrification plus scenario it comes from electric roads. Whereas in the electrification and e-fuel scenario, it is assumed that it is going to be fulfilled by electrofuels. So going a bit to the results side, this slide shows the final energy demand for the different scenarios. So this is for 2017, 2030, and this is the 2050. And this is the final energy demand in 2050 for the different scenarios. So here you can see that petrol and diesel and jet fuel, they make up the bulk of the overall energy demand in 2017 as well as in 2050, and a small portion of it over here in the baseline scenario in 2050 is because of electrification. So whereas in both of our scenarios, the electrification plus scenario, which is mostly concerned with direct electrification, and the electrification and e-fuel scenario, they have most of their bulks coming from electricity and jet electrofuels and electrofuels. And of course, in the electrification plus scenario, the energy coming from electricity is a bit higher than the electrification and e-fuel scenario, because here it's considered that the heavy-duty trucks are also electrified by direct electrification. And so we can see here that the final energy demand reduces by around 30% if you compare it with the business as usual scenario in 2050. And now we'll see what that means in terms of costs, this reduction in energy demand. So if you look at the transport annual system costs for the 3 different scenarios, we can see that this cost is mostly composed of the vehicle cost, the operation and maintenance cost, the infrastructure cost, and the fuel cost, of course. The major component in all of these is seems to be the vehicle cost. So in all of these, for example, you can see that the vehicle cost is the most dominant component, and after vehicle cost, the second most dominant component is the fuel cost. Now, the fuel cost is a bit tricky to model because there are a lot of uncertainties associated with the with fuels, especially with renewable fuels, which are at such a nascent stage of development, and there's a lot of processes that go into play from making fuels from electricity. So what we've tried to do is to model three different levels of fuel costs. So low, medium, and high. And this graph that you see on the slide right now is for the medium scenario. And here for the medium scenario, you can see that the electrification plus scenario, the cost for the electrification plus scenario is slightly higher than the cost for the baseline scenario. And if we talk about the fuel cost sensitivity for the high and the low scenario, for the high fuel cost and the low fuel cost, we can see that the vehicle costs still make up a bulk of the overall cost of the system, but the fuel costs, in case of the low fuel cost scenario, the electrification plus scenario is just 1% higher than the baseline scenario. So that brings me to the conclusion of this presentation, is that one of the key things to take away from this study is that extensive electrification is the key for achieving energy efficiency in the transport sector, and that is possible without incurring huge additional costs. Now, of course, there are a few costs that have not been considered in the process, and they need to be taken account for as well. For example, the cost and the energy demands for the upstream production of fuels. But from these comparisons, it seems that extensive electrification is quite substantial if we were to achieve energy efficiency in the transport sector. And the second important takeaway from this study is that electric road systems, they provide a good alternative for heavy-duty trucks where battery electrification is limited. So and electrofuels should be only reserved for the shipping and aviation sector, where since these are considered at present to be a bit inefficient as compared to direct electrification and a bit costly as compared to direct electrification. So the heavy-duty trucks should be electrified with electric road networks wherever possible. And of course, the overall effect on the whole energy system should be studied in combination with the other sectors, and that's what we're trying to do with the synergies project. So trying to bring it all together and see the effects on the overall energy system. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. And I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Hi, Hamza. Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I loved your picture of the electric lorries in London in 1907. I'd like to ask you where you got that and access it myself. It was a great one. Can you say something about electrofuels and what are they, and whether hydrogen is in any way linked with your study?
Yeah, so to talk a bit about the electrofuels in general, there are just fuels that are in very plain terms that are produced from electricity. So you have carbon dioxide, or you have and you have water. You break water into hydrogen, and then you combine the hydrogen with the carbon dioxide to create different fuels like methanol or ammonia if you have nitrogen. So, and in this study, in the electrification and e-fuel scenario, hydrogen was also a part of it, but not all of the fuels were based on hydrogen, because, for example, for the shipping sector, methanol as a fuel is much more useful than hydrogen, because hydrogen also needs to be compressed, and then you have the added um, the mass of the storage. So whereas methanol, which is also an electrofuel, can be used almost as a drop-in fuel with small modifications. So there are different kinds, and we believe that some not all electrofuels are equal, and some are suited for one sector, whereas the others are suited for another sector.
My understanding of what you're saying is that direct electrification is generally more cost effective than e-fuels where it's possible to do so.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of our co-panelists, Pedro, was thinking sort of along the same lines as me in terms of the question, because I was wondering about if you're using ERS and your trucks are using direct electricity. I wonder if you're considering time of use electricity, because obviously we have will increasingly have surplus electricity overnight, which will have a different cost to it. So if you're recharging batteries for trucks overnight rather than running trucks to directly discharging the grid. And Pedro is also asking about the implications of the grid reinforcement. So perhaps there's two separate questions there. There's one about time of use, and there's one about grid reinforcement implications.
Yeah, I think we also, when we talk about the cost of electricity for the time of use, the operators that are running the truck, the fuel cost of electricity, there's not a huge difference between electricity cost for the operators to incur to plan their journeys according to the charging abilities. So I mean, it could be considered to have two different levels to also include the time of use, but the most important factor for the operators is the ability to go from point A to point B, because if they do not if they change their business model based on the fuel for the heavy duty trucks, then they would incur some other losses, for example in late delivery. So the most important for them is to get from point A to B, and that's where we think that the e-roads, because you have them all the time available on the highway network, so they can charge at any time. But in the future, if the time of use and the electricity the prices, they become huge, so it could be possible to have different charging levels, and then we think that the market should decide whether to charge them overnight or whether to just go as business as usual. But that's up to the operators to see if it's in their profit margins. And the second question about the consideration of the increase in the power generation, if I understand correctly. So in our current study, that was not taken into account. So the the um, the the more production of energy, um, the addition of new power plants and all that stuff that are needed for direct electrification, that is not taken into account, and that should be catered in the final analysis. So and that also talks a bit about the broader question of the energy system. So how different sectors are also coupled together, and if we could use the excess electricity from renewables for the transport sector, and if we could have a buffer in between, like a storage or something. So yeah, that was not taken into account, but in the final analysis, it should be considered somehow.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Hamza. We have another question actually come through through Hoover, but I think it probably is more suited to the general debate at the end. So it's okay. We'll perhaps move on to Pedro now. We're going to start talking about some of the issues we've just raised actually in terms of the time of use, vehicle to grid, vehicle to house, and all this kind of discussion. So thank you very much for now, Hamza. Look forward to seeing you at the end of the other presentations.
Thank you.
So Pedro Maura is assistant professor at the University of Coimbra and a researcher at the Institute of Systems and Robotics. He was a visiting scholar at Carnegie Mellon University, Comillas Pontifical University, and Technical University of Madrid. His background is in electrical and computer engineering, as a PhD in energy from the University of Coimbra. Research activities focused on smart grids and energy planning, with research work on topics such as demand-side management and demand response programs, grid integration of renewable energy generation, electric vehicles, energy storage, and rural electrification. Been involved in more than 40 national and European projects related to energy efficiency, renewable generation, and smart grids. So I think it's fair to say he's more than well qualified to talk about the topic we're just about to hear about. Speak to you soon, Pedro. Thank you.
The work Smart Management of Electrical Vehicles for the Optimization of Renewable Energy Communities is a result of a collaboration between researchers from the Carnegie Mellon University and University of Coimbra. Due to environmental objectives, the generation mix in most countries is increasingly based on distributed, intermittent, and non-dispatchable sources. In the case of Portugal, about 55% of the electricity generation is ensured by renewable generation, already leading to a surplus of generation during winter nights. Additionally, the objective is to increase the penetration level to 100% by 2050, and 50% of the new capacity will be photovoltaic generation, being 25% integrated into buildings. Therefore, addressing the mismatch between the on-site renewable generation and electricity demand in buildings requires flexible energy resources to maintain the balance between demand and generation. Then it will be fundamental to have a resilient transitive grid, and for such an objective, it will be crucial the integration and management of new technologies to provide flexibility. Simultaneously, electrical vehicles are becoming prominent electricity consumers, and Portugal also aims at 70% electrification of transports by 2050. Electrical vehicles can significantly contribute to providing the needed flexibility in large buildings through the management of the charging period, using the building-to-vehicle system, or by storing energy using the vehicle-to-building system. The lack of residential charging leads to an increase in reliance on public and workplace charging. Therefore, a large share of the charging will be inserted at large public and commercial buildings, and control of the charging during the parking period can ensure a high flexibility level to ensure the matching between the local generation and demand in such buildings or communities. However, typically, electrical vehicles and large public and commercial buildings do not belong to the same entity, which its implications are often overlooked in the literature. Then, there is a need of establishing an economic relationship between the building and the electrical vehicle users. A major barrier is that in Portugal and most countries, the regulation does not yet allow selling and buying electricity directly between buildings and electrical vehicle users. Therefore, novel methodologies to solve the limitations for the implementation of vehicle-to-building systems are needed. Simultaneously, the new legislation for self-consumption of renewable generation in Portugal enables the establishment of communities in order to create the renewable generation surplus. Therefore, the flexibility inserted by battery storage and electrical vehicles can also be aggregated to ensure coordination at the community level. In this work, a transactive energy market for community microgrids constituted by large public and commercial buildings was designed. In the context of the community, each building can sell generation surplus to the grid or other building in the community, as well as buy electricity from the grid or from the community. Therefore, the formulation implements a market between the building of the community, determining the tariffs for the transaction of renewable generation surplus in the community, being such tariffs in direct competition with the grid tariffs. This provides incentives for regulated matching between demand and photovoltaic generation while ensuring the minimization of electricity costs. The aggregation ensures the sharing of generation surplus between buildings using battery storage and electrical vehicles as a flexibility resource, being the management of such resources inserted at the building level. A transactive market between buildings and electrical vehicle users is also established by connecting the value of electricity and parking duration. The building sells parking, being the electrical vehicle charging and added value service. However, the parking costs can be reduced if the electrical vehicle user allows the use of vehicle to building, considering a tariff that ensures the compensation for battery degradation. In order to provide incentives for higher charging flexibility, a reward for the idle period was also considered in our model. With such an approach, the building is not trading electricity, but only selling parking services, and the energy is only going to be used in the building and not directly injected into the grid. Therefore, this can be implemented with existing regulation in Portugal, and there is no need to change the business relationship with the grid. This also eliminates the need for data that is not easily obtained, such as the state of charge, since the user only has to provide information about desired parking, charging, and discharging periods. In the case of electrical vehicles, the implemented formulation evaluates the user charging and discharging periods in each time slot based on the user positive or negative power, being the total periods obtained by integrating the user periods during all time slots. Then, the total charging period must ensure the period required by the user, and the compensation of discharging and the total discharging period must be lower than the maximum value defined by the user. Additionally, in each time slot, the total user discharging is always lower than the user charging, ensuring that a state of charge lower than the initial value is never achieved. The idle period used for flexibility can then be obtained with the parking, charging, and discharging periods. In the case of battery storage, the implemented formulation manages the charging and discharging, taking into account the restrictions associated with maximum and minimum state of charge and maximum charging and discharging power. At the community level, the power flow between each building and the community is limited by the net load in each building, considering the impact of flexibility resources. And each building can only export to the community if other building needs to import such energy. Regarding the tariffs, the tariffs in the communities are limited by the tariffs offered by the grid in order to ensure economic advantages with use of community, including the costs associated with the grid use between buildings. The price signals are then adapted for the market conditions by linking the tariffs with the availability of renewable generation surplus. The proposal formulation aims at minimizing the costs in all buildings of the community, including electricity and electrical vehicle parking costs. The total parking costs for each electrical vehicle are obtained with the parking costs, the flexibility reward, as well as the charging costs and the charging reward over all time steps. The electricity costs are obtained with costs associated with electricity imported from the grid or from the community, and the profit associated with electricity injected into the grid or to the community. The formulation was then simulated using data from the University of Coimbra, being considered data from March, since it is a month with intermediate consumption and generation levels. Data for 4 buildings was considered in order to have buildings with photovoltaic generation surplus and others with a generation deficit, being considered an average demand of 500 megawatts hour a year, photovoltaic systems with 250 kilowatts, and lithium-ion batteries with 19 kilowatts hour. It was considered a tariff for the electricity consumed from the grid with an average cost equal to the actual average cost of the tariff in the reference building, but with a variation proportional to the wholesale market in order to be linked with the availability of renewable generation at the grid level. For the electricity exported to the grid, a flat tariff was considered with value established by the market. 30 profiles of electrical vehicles were then used with parking, charging, and discharging profiles aligned with the typical use in such buildings, and tariffs for the parking, charging, discharging, and flexibility with values that ensure a cost-effective operation to buildings and electrical vehicle users. Then, 6 electrical vehicles were randomly selected to be charging in each one of the buildings. The formulation was simulated considering management only at building level, then without the market between the buildings of the community, and with management at the community level. It was also simulated considering as flexibility resources only the electrical vehicles or the electrical vehicles and battery storage. Considering only electrical vehicles, the results show that electrical vehicles preferentially charge in periods of negative net load, using the generation surplus, and discharge in periods of positive net load, therefore compensating the generation deficits. It is important to note that the presented net load is from the grid point of view, not including the power flow between the building and the community. This justifies the different profiles for the individual and community management, since in community management, the community acts as an additional flexibility resource. Adding the battery storage also charges during the night, taking advantage of the period with lower tariffs, being such energy partially used to ensure the charging of the first electrical vehicles in the morning. The impact of community management was also visible in such results. Comparing it with the baseline, by including the electrical vehicles, the electricity costs increase due to the higher demand required for charging. However, due to use of charging flexibility, it was possible to achieve an electricity consumption increase of 30% with even a lower cost. Additionally, by considering community management, it was possible to reduce the electricity cost by 3%, and considering the charging cost, the total cost relative to the baseline were reduced by 27% for community management. As conclusions, this work proposes a novel method to establish a realistic transitive energy market for energy sharing in Portugal. The energy trade is envisioned at the community microgrid level between large buildings in order to ensure an aggregated matching between generation and demand with minimum cost. Such a community uses electrical vehicles and battery storage as flexibility resources and proposes a mathematical formulation that enables the implementation of vehicle-to-building systems while following the current Portuguese legislation that does not allow electricity transactions between electrical vehicle users and buildings. Therefore, a transitive energy market between buildings and electricity vehicles, in which parking time and added value service are the currency that facilitates the economic relationship, was also established. The formulation was simulated considering 4 buildings, showing that the proposed solution results in maximizing matching between local renewable generation and electricity demand, using the flexibility provided by the battery storage, electrical vehicles, as well as import and export to the community. The results also show a higher reduction of costs and a higher self-consumption of local renewable generation, achieving it with the community management. Therefore, highlighting the effectiveness of the proposal formulation. Thank you very much for your time. And if you need any further information, feel free to contact me.
I can learn to understand.
Sorry, I clicked the wrong button. Thanks, Pedro. That was lots of interesting stuff in there. It made me think of I've got something a tariff by a company called Octopus. I don't know if it operates in Portugal, but an agile tariff which provides me with real-time electricity prices, so I can monitor the price of electricity as it is, at this moment. And occasionally I'll get an alert to say we've got the sun's shining, the wind's blowing, we've got a massive surplus of electricity. Switch everything on, and we'll pay you to do it. So I guess this is an example of the kind of innovative tariff that we're going to need and we're going to see more of. I wonder if you have examples in Portugal.
We don't have much practical examples of use of these innovative tariffs. We have some pilots in terms of implementation, but in terms of real tariffs that we have available in Portuguese market, they are the time of use tariffs, the normal ones with 2, 3, or 4 periods, depending on the size of the consumer. But we believe that in the near future, we are going to need much more innovative tariffs in order to align the availability of resources with the needs from the grid. And in this work, we are trying to do it with 2 different types of tariffs. One from the grid point of view, the tariff from the grid that we have aligned with the tariff that we find now in the wholesale market, that is very well correlated with the availability of renewables at the grid level. And we have also established a community of buildings, and we have established a market between different buildings. And the tariffs in the community are also aligned with the availability of renewables in the community, then providing incentives to reduce the consumption, and in this case, for instance, discharging the electrical vehicles every time that we don't have enough renewable generation, and in the other way around, try to concentrate the demand, and in this case, concentrating the charging of electrical vehicles in periods where we have a very high availability of renewable generation in our community, then inserting with these tariffs the optimization of the use of the resources, not only in the building, but also in the community and also in the grid level.
You gave some very good and compelling examples of the potential size of the prize if we get flexibility right, and we maximize the opportunities from the flexibility offered by the electrification of transport. Can you give us perhaps an overall example of of how big that prize is? What is the if we maximize all the flexibility opportunities, how much can we reduce the requirement to build new electric capacity and the need for grid reinforcement, all that kind of stuff?
Yes, it always depends on the quantity, on the share of the electrical vehicles that we are considering. But in our case, at least in these buildings that we have assessed and considering the data that we have in this community, it was possible to increase the electricity demand by 30% without increasing the costs, even with the lower cost. Then we are able to provide 30% more electricity, in this case, to be used by the electrical vehicles without increasing the cost, just using the flexibility of resources to concentrate the demand in periods with lower tariffs, and also taking advantage of the batteries with the vehicle to building system to also charge some extra energy in periods with very low tariffs to discharge again in periods with the highest tariffs, and to use that energy in the buildings of the community. And at least in this example, of course, it depends a lot on the variation of demand and the type of buildings that we are considering. In these buildings, they are from our university. They have typical profile, mainly concentrating the demand during the day, and also the availability of vehicles. But it was possible to increase a lot the demand without increasing the cost, just with management.
Yeah, so the prize is considerable. You talked about the creation of renewable energy communities as one desirable way of getting to that point. I was just wondering who will facilitate the creation of those communities? How will they come about, and what will the drivers be for those? And are there existing examples of the kind of thing you mean, currently?
Yes, now with new legislation in Portugal, you can have the so-called renewable energy communities with the main objective of sharing the surplus of renewable generation, because until some years ago, every time that we have a surplus generation in one building, the only option was to sell it to the grid and with a predefined price. Nowadays, we can establish a community between different buildings. Then instead of selling the energy to the grid, we can use it in a different building of the community. And then we can increase the matching locally instead of always sending to the grid, and with losses and the reinforcement of the grid, we can use in our neighborhood the surplus of generation that we have from one building to the other. And also in terms of costs, of course, we can provide lower costs with this management of the community, helping each other with the surplus of generation every time that we have a surplus, instead, of course, of selling to the grid. Because at least in Portugal, every time that we are selling the PV generation surplus to the grid, we are losing money, because the price is the tariff nowadays is very low to the energy that's injected into the grid. And then if you can use it in another building, we can not only improve the technical management of the grid and the optimization of the community, but also in terms of costs. We can decrease the costs of the use of the energy into the buildings. That, I think, it's the main advantage of these renewable energy communities.
So will the market, do you think, create this kind of opportunity, or does the regulators need to step in to facilitate it?
The legislation already allows it. I think now we need more steps in terms of market, because the issue is nowadays also the quantity of buildings with a large share of PV generation is not yet large enough to establish a large group of communities. But I think that at least in large buildings we are going to have large opportunities, because most large buildings already have PV generation, and in the near future we are going to have lots of parking spots also in the large buildings to charge electrical vehicles, and we are going to have a very high level of flexibility with the charging and discharging of these electrical vehicles, even with static batteries in the buildings, but just with this capacity of charging and discharging vehicles in parking lots, in large parking lots of large buildings. They can be a very high resource of flexibility in these communities, in order to achieve this matching between the availability of the renewables in different buildings and demand. And then I believe that in the near future, with this increase that we are seeing now in the penetration of PV in buildings, and also in share of electrical vehicles, we are going to see much more these kind of communities.
Thanks, Pedro. That I could ask you lots more questions, but I don't want to shortchange Ishan, who's coming on next, but we'll speak to you a bit more at the end, I hope.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to introduce now Ishan Band. Ishan completed his MSc in Power and Energy Systems from the National Institute of Technology in 2020. He completed his thesis work on the topic of loss allocation under the transactive energy regime. He started his career with an internship at the Alliance for an Energy Efficient Economy, and has been working as a consultant research associate. His interests include power system modeling and optimization, distribution grids, demand-side management, and vehicle grid integration. So we're continuing on a similar theme that we've just been discussing with Pedro. Speak to you soon, Ishan.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ishan Band, and I'm working as a research consultant at Alliance for an Energy Efficient Economy. AEEE is a leading non-profit organization, and we work on creating awareness towards energy efficiency as a resource. Today, my topic of presentation will be smart charging strategies to support e-mobility in India. This is the brief table of content that we'll be covering tonight, and we have reviewed some of the international pilots, some of the experience for VGI, and we have defined some key learnings that might be applicable in India, and those will be again discussed in the concluding remarks. So the transport sector is getting decarbonized, and there's an increased uptake of EVs in India. Now, when these EVs are connected to the power grid or the distribution network in an unmanaged way, they can prove quite deterrent, quite harmful to the entire network. AEE's understanding of VGI can be defined as the pathways to utilize EV as a valuable grid resource. VGI can be broadly classified under active and passive charging controls, and depending whether the control signal is coming from the grid, terminology of V1G and V2G is used. So when we talk about V1G or V2G, V1G is basically unidirectional flow of power. That is, the power can be controlled only from grid to vehicle and not vice versa. It is also sometimes referred to as smart charging control, and it includes ramping up and down of charge rate for either the individual EV or aggregated. When we talk about V2G, it's basically the bidirectional flow of power between the grid and vehicle. Through this ability, the vehicle is able to serve isolated loads as well. That is, the energy stored in battery can be fed back to either grid, home, or building. The entire gamut is also referred as vehicle to everything. Now, V2G offers substantial value proposition over V1G, but is complex and expensive to deploy, whereas V1G offers less value, but is again less complicated uh, as compared to V2G. We have identified some of the value streams from the VGI. The first is the energy arbitrage. This is more on consumer centric value proposition. V1G through V1G EV user can actually reduce his or her charging costs, whereas through V2G measures, EV user can actually earn more by injecting the stored energy. The other three benefits are basically grid centric or the network centric benefits that includes peak shaving, supporting RA integration, and ancillary service provision. When we talk about the EV ecosystem in India, it's quite nascent, and there have been increased efforts from both the central and the state governments to accelerate the EV adoption in India. The central government efforts of faster adoption and manufacturing of EVs, both phase 1 and phase 2, which was developed under National Mission on Electric Mobility. FAME 2 has notified an allocation of close to $1.4 billion, out of which 140 million is for charging infrastructure alone. Transport being a concurrent subject in India, state governments have also been notifying different policies related to EV and trying to accelerate the uptake through various incentives. However, when we talk about V1G or V2G, in India, there are no specific policy provisions. According to our study, we have classified the evolution of VGI into three brief timelines. That is, the early years of VGI when the research was still going for technical feasibility and other requirements. Between 2012 and 2015 was the demonstration of technical viability of V2G measures, and from 2016 to the present date, we are still experimenting and researching on the commercial feasibility of V2G measures. These are some of the pilots that we reviewed, and we have found that the consumer participation and consumer satisfaction was quite high. Service readiness level is again very high. Uh, uh, the V2G measures are technically ready, and the commercial feasibility is still being tested out. After reviewing the pilots, the VGI pilots, we have listed out some of the learnings that might be applicable in the Indian context, or for that matter, any other developing EV market. The first and foremost we can list out is acknowledging EV as a valuable grid resource. Until and unless there are clear-cut guidelines, clear regulatory frameworks on defining EV as a resource, it would stay as a means of mobility and would not be able to provide grid-related services. Some of the other learnings we have identified were enabling aggregation of EVs, uh, attractive incentive structure for both the EV users and the electrical network, design of proper DR programs with good M&V protocols. Uh, there's a need to establish ancillary service market as much of the value proposition from VGI is being tested out in that area, and enabling third-party resource aggregation. Now, when we talk about what regulatory changes are needed, we have listed out pricing as the foundational, as the key regulatory instrument for enabling the benefits of PGI. Price signals would be necessary to shift the EV charging, the EV loads from peak to off-peak periods. We can definitely start off with implementing time of use rates, and as the technology, as the adoption matures, we can gradually shift towards grid reflective real-time pricing. Some of the other regulatory changes that we had identified were again defining EV as a grid resources. We need clear regulatory guidance on what constitutes as a resource. Is it the EV? Is it the EVAC? Is it the battery in itself, etc. To add to this, aggregation would definitely complicate resource definition. Aggregation is another key regulatory changes that would be required. This is mainly for extending the value proposition, as a smaller number of EVs are basically inadequate to provide valuable grid services. In the subsequent sections, we have discussed the role of distribution utilities in aggregation of EVs. Uh, Regulatory changes are also required in the safety and interconnection. These can be different for both V1G and V2G, and we need clear-cut guidance to establish standardized communication protocols. So how utilities can make use of EV aggregation? DISCOM, due to its inherent nature of business, can be regarded as the aggregator of entire loads, and therefore the first two models that we have identified are DISCOM centric, as the DISCOM either solely or through aggregator would take required services from the EVs. The other two models that we have identified are competitive aggregation without the need of discount. That is, the aggregator is accumulating all the EV loads and providing the services directly to the wholesale or the ancillary market. Whereas in the hybrid model, both the EV and the aggregator would fight for accumulating EV as a grid resource, and both the discom and aggregator can offer their services to the wholesale and the ancillary or balancing markets. For the concluding remarks, we would like to highlight that V2G is a revolutionary technology, but as the EV adoption, as the EV market in India is still in its nascent stages, the feasibility of V2G could be limited. The main challenges could be listed out as lack of hardware. That is, the Indian ecosystem do not have EVs that are capable of providing bidirectional charge. Um, In addition to that, the EV manufacturers have concern regarding battery degradation through V2G mechanism. When we talk about aggregation challenges, EV aggregation actually holds the key to achieve commercial success of V2G measures, and aggregation norms are still not identified in India. The regulatory ecosystem in India is not is unfavorable for EVs. We have not defined how EV can be recognized as a grid resource. Uh, we have limitations to various time varying tariffs, and the Indian power market does not have a product of ancillary service mechanism. However, regulatory frameworks are still being developed. Central regulators are innovative through their process, and we are optimistic that sooner we will have the regulations pertaining to the VGI benefits. Another key challenge is the low capacity of EV batteries. So, as of now, the Indian EV market is mostly dominated by either two or three wheelers, and the scale of aggregation actually required for valuable grid related services is quite high. The second key conclusion is that in India, V1G is actually the low hanging fruit. Uh, it can help facilitate shifting of loads, shifting of EV loads to off peak periods, and V1G does not require much system upgrades to the existing network. Um, Appropriate or suitable price signals are enough for enabling the V1G through the use of smart meters, which are readily available in the Indian market. Some of the challenges inherent to the V1G adoption are the missing backend communication, that is, the interaction between EV and the grid. Communication standards are not well defined. Um, OCPP, that is the Open Charge Point Protocol, is the only standard that is commonly used in India. Second challenge is pertaining to the lack of dynamic tariffs. In India, the dynamic tariffs are limited to the time of day pricing. However, they are applicable only to certain consumers. TOD might become less effective as the EV adoption in the Indian market increases, and we can definitely move towards real-time pricing, which can actually reflect the existing grid conditions or the wholesale market pricing. So, thank you for this. We would like to acknowledge Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, Mr. Shyamashis Das and Dr. Sanchari Deb, our ex-colleagues from IEEE, for their valuable contributions to the paper. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Ishan. Can you let us see you? Are you there? Hi, Ishan. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much for that.
Yes, me.
Thank you very much for that interesting insight into what's happening in India in terms of V1G and V2G at the moment. Very interesting. You talked about the lack of hardware in terms of vehicles. I was just interested to explore what proportion of the car market in India is provided by local products, and what proportion are imported.
So when we talk about four-wheelers, there have been quite innovating technologies, but as of now on the road, we have very less models. Tata being one of the local manufacturers that are doing their share of work, while we have some other models that are from outside manufacturers. That is the Hyundai Kona and from MG. When you say that the EV adoption or the four-wheeler adoption, it's quite less as compared to the two-wheelers or three-wheelers in India.
Yeah, and I guess the reason for asking the question is I think a lot of models now produced in Europe do have V2G capability. So that, you know, depending on the level of imports, the more possibility to that the hardware won't be a barrier to V2G. Yeah. I suppose a similar question to the one I asked Pedro.
Can you repeat the question?
Sorry. Yeah. Well, just, I mean, it was really just a sort of a comment that the more imported.
I guess I'm having bandwidth issues.
We're losing sync, I think, Ishan. I'll just try one separate question that's similar to the one I asked to Pedro. In terms of the size of the prize, how big is the difference between V1G and V2G in terms of the Indian context? You know, is V2G, if it were possible, is it very much bigger than V1G?
So if you like, when we talk about the Indian context, we are yet to finalize, you know, the value proposition. How big of a difference would be from V1G or V2G? That is mainly because we still lack the regulatory ecosystem. We still lack the pilot demonstration in this, and we still have to, you know, innovate our measures in both the technology and the regulatory ecosystem.
Ishan, because we're running short of time, I'm going to ask the others to join us in the conversation, and we'll carry on with some of this discussion as well. But thank you very much for the presentation. So thanks for coming back, Pedro and Hamza. I'm afraid Cornelius had to go for a meeting with the German government, I understand. I've got quite a question for you to think about as a last question. I don't want you to answer it right away. But it's more general and perhaps a bit more challenging. The question is from Vesna Kollega, and it's as some kind of conclusion. Could you list and surely explain 5 most effective measures? I mean, I might say 3 would perhaps be sufficient, but 5 if you can do it. 5 most effective measures to decrease energy consumption in the transportation sector at the European level. Particularly difficult one for you, Ishan, as you're not in Europe, but you might want to answer it in terms of India. But I'll come back to you about that. So it's just give you a little bit of thinking time to, you know, to list a few ideas. Another question that came through earlier, and it probably relates more to the first couple of presentations. I'm not sure how much you will have looked into this area, but the growth in electric vehicles is obviously going to result in a large number of surplus batteries. We're going to have by 2050, many batteries will be 20 to 30 years old. I think the question is, you know, how are we going to handle this? You know, and maybe, you know, are there implications perhaps for the, you know, for grid backup and, you know, opportunities in that area? Pedro, you look as though you might have.
Yes, we have some work in this area. I think that is in fact a great opportunity because in the near future, with the need of replacement these batteries from the electrical vehicles, they are not going to be any more effective to the daily use in the electrical vehicle, but the capacity in batteries is still high. And then we can reuse it in buildings. And then I believe that in the near future, we are going to have a much higher availability of batteries in buildings with much lower costs because it can reuse the batteries that we are going to take from the electrical vehicles can be a good source of flexibility to put in the buildings and even in residential buildings because after replacing battery from your electrical vehicle, you can take the battery and to reaccommodate it to use it in your building to ensure the integration of your PV generation. That I think that at least in the beginning, it's a great opportunity because you are going to use it in the buildings. Of course, after the use of the buildings, you are going to need to recycle it. We are going to delay the problem. And regarding this end of life and the recycling part, I don't have so much experience, but I have about this first reuse of the reuse it in buildings. And we believe that is a great opportunity because the batteries are still very effective to be used in buildings and costs can be very low with use of these batteries.
Okay, another question that occurred to me, it relates really more to the first 2 presentations and probably particularly to Cornelius, who's not here, but maybe Hamza, you've got thoughts about it, but or others may have as well. You know, we talked. Cornelius was talking about the total cost of ownership of vehicles and how much lower the cost of the use phase of EVs is. We haven't discussed rebound effects. You know, with much lower cost of per mile travel. You know, are we potentially, if you know, in an unregulated situation, are we potentially looking at, you know, people using their EVs a lot more because it's cheaper to do so? So more congestion, you know, implications for life cycle emissions and resource use. If anybody has any thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, I can talk a bit about that. I think when we talk about the general discussion about energy efficiency in general, rebound effect is something that comes up quite often, and especially if we look at the transport sector, and then if we're comparing the electric vehicles with the internal combustion engine vehicles, and even if we have the rebound effect that so to say that electricity is cheap, or it consumes less energy, so people are more inclined to use their cars more. I think the net benefit would still favor the electric vehicles, because if you just look at the huge disproportionate difference between the well-to-wheel efficiencies for the internal combustion engine vehicles and the battery electric vehicles, it's around the magnitudes of 4 times the difference in energy efficiency if you look at the electric vehicles. So I think that most of the energy savings might be able to absorb some of the rebound effects that might occur with the adoption of electric vehicles. And regarding the question about the huge inflow of electric batteries in the coming years, I think I quite very much agree with Pedro here, because I think there is a huge opportunity for in terms of second life batteries that are going to be coming into the market. I think there was a McKinsey report published some weeks before that. They mentioned that there's in 2030 the second life vehicle market is going to be worth around more than 30 billion. So like Pedro mentioned, these second life batteries, though they are not suitable to be used again in as part of battery electric vehicles, they could be suited for uninterruptible power supplies in buildings with your CPUs, or in server rooms in general, or even if they're standardized from different battery manufacturers and car manufacturers, then they could be even combined into different modules and be used as ancillary services for grid operations and stuff like that. So I think that there is a huge opportunity for another market that is coming up.
Thanks, Hamza. That's interesting. I mean, I think that part of that answer relates to another thought that I've been having about this panel, and particularly to the last two presentations. It's, you know, this is a conversation that affects very much the building sector. It affects the power sector. We're having it here in the transport and mobility panel, which, you know, can be considered to be a bit of a silo. But in your experience in your countries, are people involved with transport electrification getting together with people in the buildings and the power sector to look at the benefits from flexibility, the benefits from, you know, looking at domestic heating, for example, in combination with vehicle electrification? Because it strikes me that the prize is much bigger if you look at it as a whole than just at transport. So welcome any of your comments about that.
I guess I can
Hisham.
take that. As you mentioned, I guess talking EVs in silos would not solve the problem. It's more about coupling both the sectors and how well do you couple. As Hamza also mentioned, I guess in the long run, these batteries can well be used for the second life batteries can be well used for server rooms and buildings. And when we talk about the ecosystem of how flexibility research is going, or how EVs can provide grid related services, For the flexibility, we are still in the development stages. The research is still going on. Our institutions are still trying to develop a concept note, trying to put up a pilot project. But as of now, no large scale facility is there for India.
Pedro, in Portugal, do you see much integration, collaboration between these different sectors?
Yes, we have some collaboration. I think we already have a strong collaboration between transportation and the electrical grid. Not so much about the buildings and construction and that kind of issues. Regarding electrical grid, yes, about the impacts and the reinforcement of the infrastructure, and also aligning these objectives of transportation with the availability of renewables, and then the reduction of global emissions associated with transportation. But I think we still need to do more regarding buildings, because the buildings are going to be quite important, because most of charging is going to be in buildings, and the electrical vehicles can have a negative impact if not controlled in terms of the low demand of the buildings, but can also be a very good resource of flexibility into the management and the reduction of costs. And I think in the next step, we need to think, of course, we still need to think about the global electrical grid, but also trying to think also about internally in each one of the buildings, and mainly in large buildings, and also in communities, and putting together all the different pieces.
Do you have anything to add? If you could be brief, because I wanted to get on to the last that question I raised earlier.
Yeah, I think the flexibility markets vary quite a lot, even if you look at Europe. But I do believe there are a lot of companies that are coming together as aggregators, and to connect with the consumers. So I think the space is still developing, and there's a lot of interesting things that are going on here.
Thank you very much. If I could just challenge you with Vesna's question then about the most effective measures to decrease energy consumption in terms of transport at the EU or the Indian level in terms of Ishan. Just if you have even 3 or 2 very top line thoughts, that would be very interesting. Who'd like to start?
Yeah, I can start perhaps with the 3 measures that I think are prominent. I would still go with the conclusions of the results that I presented earlier, that electrification wherever possible is the way to go, just because of the huge amounts of energy efficiency savings that we're able to achieve. And the second part could be the perhaps more on the institutional level, that to invest more in innovation, so as to develop more resource efficient technologies. For example, increasing the energy density of batteries, or and coming up with new ways to mold batteries into the structures, like what Tesla has presented some business models related to that. So electrification, innovation, and the third, I would perhaps go back to some of the discussions about recycling of the electric batteries. So perhaps there is a need for standardization for different electric batteries that are coming into the market. So we could perhaps increase the extraction of maximum value from this emerging market. So electrification, innovation, and regulation. So
great.
That would be the 3.
Thanks, Sam. So that's lovely. Pedro, some thoughts?
Yes, I definitely agree with Anzaf. I think these 3 are the main important points. Of course, electrification, innovation, recycling. I will just add also the tariffs part. I think the incentives through the tariffs, and mainly after the electrification, to the effective management of the vehicles, to provide incentives to have the charging aligned with the availability of renewables, in order to ensure that we are going to have electrification, and at the same time we are taking advantage of this electrification to increase the use of renewable generation, is going to be quite important, and also to provide different incentives to ensure that we have the electrification without increasing too much the costs and the need of resources in the electrical grid.
Thanks, Pedro. And Ishan, sorry, I have to be brief because we're running way over time. I'm afraid.
Definitely. So I to add to that, electrification, I guess decentralization and improving the transparency along all the regulatory frameworks and policies, that would be a key step in reducing the energy consumption and going towards electrification.
Well, thanks, Ishan. Thanks very much, Hamza. Thanks, Pedro, for a really interesting session and some great presentations. My colleague Drajan will be chairing the panel 6 tomorrow. I'd just like to say before we go that there's 3 panel sessions starting at 2:30 CET, and then there's going to be some great informal sessions on energy and comfort indicators, which are hosted by the Africa-Europe Bioclimatic Buildings for the 21st Century. That's after the afternoon panel sessions. Thanks once again for the session today, and hope to see you around the platform at the social on Thursday night, if not before. Many thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very
so
much.